we've asked for this session, we've tried to get perspectives from across a range of actors that are represented here today. And the idea of this session is just to sort of reflect on what we've covered and come up with what we see as, from the different perspectives, what are the key challenges and what are the emerging issues in education in crises and protracted emergencies. So we have got, I'll just try and introduce you in the order. We've got, so we've got John Shotton, who's from the perspective of a practitioner from the Girls' Education in South Sudan, the GUESS program, which is implemented by Cambridge Education, our hosts here. So he'll be giving the practitioner perspective of what this actually means on the ground. We have Alan Smith from Ulster University, who has been in this research field for a lot longer than before it was a field. So to give an academic perspective. We have Benoit, who spoke this morning, to give the perspective from UNHCR, which is slightly unfair because he's only just joined UNHCR. But I think giving the perspective perhaps more widely, I should say, from the UN, from UN agencies, because he's got experience, a wide experience from UN organisations. And we have two donors on the panel. We have Stijn and Emily from this morning, so from the EU and from DFID. And then, apologies, this was my failure to properly proofread the programme. We always intended to have an NGO on the board as well. So Charlotte from Save the Children is going to represent the sort of NGO perspective. Now, what we're going to do is I'm just going to ask each of them to just talk for a maximum of 5 minutes. I'm going to give the donors a bit less because they spoke this morning, and there are two of them, just to reflect on what they see as key challenges and emerging issues, and any take-homes, any strong points from what they've talked about today. I'm then going to let them challenge each other and ask questions to each other. We're then going to sort of do a 5-minute slots for questions from each of the 3 workshop streams, and I've picked on people to come up with questions, but you may have other questions that lead on from those. And then we'll open it to the wider floor, and also for those of you watching this virtually, there'll be the Twitter feed, and I'm just looking for Sandra will be feeding any questions from the Twitter feed. So hopefully there'll be a chance for everyone to put their questions to the panel or to the targeted panel. So I will just hand over. I'll start with Alan because he was prepared to start first rather than just going based on position. So we'll start with Alan. And
okay, thank you, Ruth. Is this okay? You can hear me? Yeah. Right. I hate these panels where you're asked to say what's the most important thing that should be done, because clearly there are multiple challenges. But I mean, certainly from this morning's presentations, it's hard to get past the most urgent and overwhelming need currently on most agendas is to do with maintaining the education for displaced persons, whether that be arising from conflicts, from natural disasters. We only have to think about what's happening in Sulawesi and in Yemen at the minute to see how these are important, pressing needs. So I'm kind of taking that as given, and say a little bit more in a moment about that. However, I also found Mario Novelli's remarks this morning also an important reminder that whether we're talking about displacement due to conflict or due to natural disaster, or indeed in terms of the challenges for girls' education or for challenges related to disability, which was also discussed in one of the workshops, that I'm beginning to wonder whether purely technical solutions are sufficient in addressing these challenges. That they don't seem to be enough, that we seem to be having, I mean, it might sound a little bit despondent here, but as Benoit's figures indicated, the need is growing. You know, is this what the future holds? A continual attempt to address what seems to be becoming overwhelming need of, in a sense, not what are the causes of these situations, but they're the consequences. So as whether you're working in humanitarian or development assistance, is it sufficient that we should simply be dealing with the consequences of the challenges, the global challenges that are facing us currently? And I think, whilst it may have some limitations, I think Mario's challenge that underline many of these crises, protracted or sudden onset, are often other factors out beyond the control of those of us who work in education. They're to do with political motivations, they're to do with economic conditions that are creating difficult environments for populations in various parts of the world. So when I think about my own involvement in this work, it is really about how do we get beyond simply being ameliorating, trying to deal with need. It's important. That's not to say the work is not important, but I'm making a plea, if you like, for us not, in the face of that adversity, to lose sight of thinking about where preventative thinking, preventative ways of thinking about the challenges arising in these situations should not drift off the agenda. We might get swamped by the need and forget that what's generating these problems are difficult situations, often to do with conflict, climate change, etc. I think there have been some attempts in recent years to try and maintain a preventative perspective on some of these things. Again, not perfect, but I think in my own area, thinking about the increasing attacks on education, both personnel and infrastructure, etc., there have been some important initiatives at global level. The Global Coalition for Protecting Education for Attack, and its monitoring of attacks on education isn't popular with governments, is continually challenged about the reliability of its data, etc. But doing that alongside a monitoring mechanism which tries to look at grave violations against children, I think is an attempt to say, look, we need to be engaging with states and national authorities about how their actions are not just about ameliorating the consequences of conflict, but we should be going further than that. We should be challenging national governments about how their actions are generating some of these difficulties. The strategies, it's questionable. I think we do need a little bit more research on whether some of these strategies are having an impact. Is, for example, the UN monitoring mechanism having any impact on the way states are operating? Does the encouragement, quite a lot of attention is being given to signing up to Safe Schools Declaration. 81 states have signed up for that. Is that just tokenistic, or has it led to any changes in terms of the way states engage with their own security forces, for example? We've also heard how many conflicts now are within states rather than between states, and I would see some encouragement in the activities of NGOs, for example, such as Geneva Call, who are trying to engage with non-state armed groups, trying to engage them with deeds of commitment to humanitarian principles, the protection of children in terms of their actions, their commitments to demobilise and not recruit children, to prevent sexual violence, these kind of things. I mean, it's an interesting area, but it's in danger, I think, of getting overlooked. It's an attempt to be preventative rather than simply wait and deal with the consequences. I think a potential area which may relate, for example, to work in places such as South Sudan with 70% of children out of schools, is that there are many contexts like that where communities and populations have managed to keep children educated, engaged in education, despite the most adverse circumstances. And we need to learn from those situations. We need to learn from the indigenous knowledge that is developed in those situations. We need to learn how the international community can begin to support populations when they find themselves in those situations. So there are gaps there, I think, to be filled. Probably in terms of a last challenge that I would identify is the way in which, through Education Cannot Wait and other global advocacy and initiatives, it's a challenge to humanitarian organisations to engage with education as part of educational emergencies. We know that there's been advocacy for this for the past 20 years, and there would be some success in terms of a greater engagement in that. But I think, as we discussed in one of our workshops, what does that actually mean in practice? You know, what do we know in terms of humanitarian actors in many of these difficult situations? Whenever there's a sudden crisis, where do they see education featuring on their agenda? I'm particularly encouraged, for example, by a development involving the International Committee of the Red Cross, which for the first time in its history has just last year decided to include education as a priority and introduce an education strategy. Now, that's a huge institutional challenge for a humanitarian organisation, which has a long and respected tradition of supporting affected communities in these situations. But what it really does mean is, throughout all its activities, whether it be preventative work, whether it's protection work, whether it's humanitarian assistance in sudden onsets, it's challenging the personnel working there to think about, well, am I asking affected populations about education needs? Is it coming up as a priority, etc.? And what are its implications for my particular contribution through the work of the ICRC? And I would sense that that's not a dissimilar challenge that any agency involved in humanitarian assistance is likely to face in the coming years. That's it from me.
Okay. There's an element of identity fabrication going on here, in the sense that I would love to think that I was a practitioner. I hanker to be a practitioner. I'm going to try and talk as a practitioner, but I'm not. I mean, I'm a manager within Mott MacDonald. I was involved with the design of the girls' education programme. It's very close to my heart, but certainly I'm not a practitioner. But I've drawn these few slides up, you know, with some people who were involved with the programme. Secondly, I also feel that I'm wearing the Empress's clothes. I shouldn't be here. I mean, Akuja de Garang, my colleague, who is South Sudanese and who was a refugee as a result of the original Sudanese civil war, and made a decision to go back to South Sudan to commit herself to helping to build the country. She's team lead in this programme, and I'm struck by something that Margaret said in a session, that I was there last, that this whole kind of thing has a bit of a northern flavour to it. You know, I'm the greatest representation of that northern flavour, but I can assure you that if Akuja was standing here, I mean, she would also be representing something that is very significant, I think, about the way in which we try to design and run this programme. And that also applies to many other programmes that Cambridge Education is actually implementing. Anyway, let me just give you a very quick overview about the programme. I mean, Jess preceded the GEC. But with the exception of what Emily talked about this morning in relation to disabilities, the first point and the third point, all right, which is the need to target girls and young women and also trying to work with the most marginalised groups, just fits very much into that frame. It is a substantial programme. It's just actually finished, in its first phase. The second phase is hopefully going to start shortly. But it very much fits into that kind of arena of trying to address a really serious problem in relation to girls and young women in South Sudan. 5 years ago, there were only 12,000 girls in the whole of South Sudan who were enrolled in secondary school, which is a terrible indicator, in terms of the amount of girls that are dropping out at the age of around 12 or 13. So the programme was designed to try and address this. There were many results that were anticipated. Support was going to be given to individual girls to try and address the poverty issues that exist within families by the provision of cash transfers. There was going to be a very school-based kind of quality initiative that would try to address, the quality of the learning environment, and a determination to also drive a research agenda. If I can just pick out here, number one, there were to be 200,000 girls who were directly supported by the programme. This was going to be in the form of cash transfers. If I pick out number 6, 3,400 schools were to benefit from capitation grants. The design of the programme, was rooted in talking to local communities about what they wanted, and what they wanted was cash. They wanted cash to enable the poverty agenda to be addressed within girls' families. Schools wanted cash to be able to do the things that they wanted to do in schools. And there have been many achievements of the programme. And again, let me just pick out one or two. The first one, we work in partnership with BBCMA, who've driven a community-based radio programme that goes out in 12 languages across the country to try and raise issues about providing advocacy for girls' education. Similarly, there's been an enormous initiative in relation to driving, you see the 3 bullet points in the middle, around trying to kind of drive delivering capitation grants to schools. 12 million of the 65 million pounds has been spent on capitation grants. 3 times that amount has been spent by the South Sudanese government in actually supplying capitation grants to schools. And this comes from people who said, what? You want to put money direct into schools? This was people within the South Sudanese government. It'll never work in a million years, but we demonstrated that it could work. That then enabled leverage to take place in relation to government funding. If I was to pick out, what were some key tips? In terms of how you deliver a programme in a situation as there is in South Sudan now, where the conflict, of course, has been endemic for the last 4 years. The first bullet point there, which is about taking a nationwide approach to ensure that no harm is done. That has been enormously important. It's been important for the programme to be a nationwide programme, so that all different ethnicities, that make up different parts of the country, can be addressed, with educational provision. What has also been, I think, really important in terms of how you approach the whole thing is this thing about taking a conflict-sensitive approach and recognising the emergent needs of conflict-affected communities, and that has to remain on the agenda all the time. I'm really conscious that I have to try and deliver this in 5 minutes, and I've got 1 minute left. What lessons can be learned from what we've done? Well, having a regionally appropriate radio programme, I think, that goes out nationwide has been enormously significant. Driving a data collection agenda has also been really important. Having unrestricted, lightly conditioned, adaptable, cash-led approaches. The mantra is cash works. Of course, accountability has to be there, but putting cash in the hands of local communities absolutely works, as do school-based approaches that are far more cost-effective than anything else. Getting ownership and buy-in, from the government at a both national level and at a local level has also been critical. Here we go. What gets in the way? I'm going to finish on this, all right? What gets in the way? Higher level political economy, the use of aid to drive trade deals, benefit the home base and exercise political influence. I could give you many examples of the way in which multiple donors in South Sudan have done that. The donor-recipient interest divide. You know, what is British interest? I mean, you know, what about South Sudanese interest? I'm not talking about Kir and Mashiach, but you know, what are the interests, okay, of South Sudanese people? Dare I, as a kind of ranting, aging leftist, say we rip the guts out of Africa, yeah? We rip the guts out of South Asia, we rip the guts out of Southeast Asia, and we now say we've got 13 billion to deliver, and we can deliver this, but it has to be delivered, okay, in the interests of the British. What are those interests? They certainly conflict with the interests of people in South Sudan. The IDLA and so-called development partner unilateralism and appalling levels of donor coordination. I can give you many examples of the way in which it has been dismal in South Sudan. We have an excellent relationship with DFID in South Sudan, as we have with many local offices, okay, across countries where we are managing programs. But frankly, the level of coordination between the major stakeholders, sorry Stijn, sorry Emily, you're sitting next to each other, yeah? I mean, the DFID office is next to the EU office, right, in Juba, huh? Yet neither of them, you know, I mean, have a level of communication about what each of them are doing. I find this utterly staggering. Polarisation in relation to the humanitarian sector development debate. Yeah? JESS is a sectoral programme that's tried to address the sector, and irrespective of the 70% of children who remain out of school, there are more children now attending school regularly in South Sudan than there have been at any point in its history. I mean, something has worked.
Yeah, it's on.
It's on. Perfect. I will make some comments on behalf of UNHCR, not the UN, which is slight difference. Okay, I think, first of all, it's great to see the current attention that is given to education in emergencies and to refugee education in particular. As you know, the forthcoming Global Education Monitoring Report will be on migration, displacement, and education. Last week, just a week ago, there was a high-level meeting that took place during the UN General Assembly, a meeting that was co-led by UNHCR and Save the Children, hosted by a number of organizations, including UNICEF, UNESCO, GP, INI, also the EU, Norway, Canada. And during that meeting, more than 30 organizations signed a charter for action and made pledges to support refugee education. I think what we would like to see is the attention translating into action. Then a second point is that nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something. And I think here, when it comes to inclusion, and this morning we discussed it at length, we would like to see refugees integrated into national systems. We all have a role to play. I think this is important, and try to find ways to strengthen education systems, which was part of what a number of donors is trying to do. This is very important. With 13.4 million refugees in protracted situations, we think that the temporary nature of emergency response has changed, particularly in relation to refugees, as we know that displacement is no longer temporary. Given the protracted nature of displacement, we need to shift the emphasis from quick fix to longer-term support to education systems and support to ministries of education. It will be essential to put ministries of education in the driver's seat and to provide support, build capacities so that they can provide education to all children on their territory, be them their own citizens or refugees who are currently hosted in their country. Thank you.
Thank you. I've been scribbling down a number of things from the discussions today. So I'm going to speak a little bit about trends when it comes to sort of the EU's trends in programming and policy making on education emergencies and protracted crisis, but also things that I've been hearing today, and challenges as well. So I've already mentioned this morning that education emergencies is high on the policy agenda of the EU, with 10% of allocation of humanitarian aid to education emergencies starting from next year onwards. This year it's 8%. So I think we're moving into the right direction. However, that's at the policy level. I think practice on the ground is sometimes a different reality. Alan already mentioned that what does this mean for humanitarian players in this sector? What I see, for example, is our own humanitarian colleagues on the ground. For them, education is not always a priority, right? So the thing that education is not necessarily life-saving is still around there, so on the ground. So this is just moving into the right direction, but still a lot of work to be done. An increasing trend at EU level, I would say, but also what I've been hearing now is that more development funds are needed to address education needs in protracted crisis. I've been hearing things about this today as well. I think the thinking is there at EU level. Again, when it comes to practice, there's quite a long way to go still. That this translates really into programming, focusing more on system strengthening, to include refugees, displaced people in general, making systems more resilient, stronger in order that they are able to prevent conflicts as well, or being prepared for natural disasters. So the preparedness element there, I think, still needs a lot more attention. A third trend, an immediate challenge as well, is the nexus. I've mentioned it this morning. I've heard that in some discussions this afternoon, although not that strongly, but it was mentioned a couple of times. So the humanitarian development actors and, what we also call the triple nexus, the whole thing around peace, is present there as well. So the challenge linked to this is how do you put this in practice, of course, when you have funding streams, aid streams, financing mechanisms that are not set up to do this. So I think this is gonna, I think the thinking is there, but it's gonna take time before it is materialized in true nexus approaches on the ground. The EU, for example, is now working in 6 pilot countries around the nexus. So this is the nexus in terms of joint programming between the EU, but also its member states. So it's joint analysis, joint programming, both across the humanitarian development sector programming. One of the pilot countries is Sudan, for example. Another one is Iraq, Myanmar. But this is slow. This has been ongoing now for 1 year. There's some progress in terms of programming, planning, funding even. One of the things that the EU has set up are the trust funds. Some of you might have heard about these trust funds. There's a big one for the Syria crisis, Madat Trust Fund. There's another one for Africa, which is called the Emergency Trust Fund for Africa. What is interesting about these trust funds is that they are financing mechanisms that allow the EU to merge development funding and emergency funding into one financing pot. Sudan, South Sudan are also financed by the trust fund. Yet a step into the right direction, but a lot to be done yet. The role of the private sector has not been mentioned so much today, although for the EU it's a trend in many sectors. What's the role of the private sector when it comes to education? Both in education provision and in terms of innovative financing. So this is going to receive a lot of attention of the EU in the coming years. Three specific challenges that I've also written down from the discussions today, and with which I want to end, is I think we all agree on that there's gaps in knowledge, more evidence is needed, but the funding is not always there. But the funding for longer-term research initiatives is not always there. But I think it's also a responsibility on both sides. Sometimes I see projects in which there is space to allocate budget for evidence building, but then the budget line for quality M&E and impact assessment is a fraction of the whole budget. So I think it's sometimes a shared responsibility as well. And then a point that was raised today, and I've also, that I was intrigued by, was the better sharing of knowledge, better sharing of evidence, sharing evidence more efficiently at all levels. And I think that there's a lot of potential to do this, not necessarily in this global fora and meetings in New York and London and Brussels, but at the national level. So through the structures in country, through the local education groups, the education clusters, the relations that the donors have with the authorities, and so on and so forth, and the NGOs as well, and the private sector organizations. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So I am going to be very brief, as promised, and I know I spoke earlier on. A couple of things I'd like to highlight. In terms of the trends, I suppose, yes, we are seeing much more engagement from more traditionally development and humanitarian actors. We need to be getting the politics and the policies around that right to be able to get education there at the very beginning, as well as the long-term responses that we've been discussing. On coordination, to hear that about donor coordination is, of course, concerning. We know the challenges around coordination. We also know we need to do it better. Yes, that applies to donors. It also applies to how we're working with UN agencies, with our implementing partners in country, where they may also be getting funding from across different sources. How are we sharing resources? How are we sharing data where possible? How are we having more ongoing conversations at a national level around what we mean by quality education and getting any alignment in the standards that we're talking about? In terms of the points earlier that I and others have raised around the quality of education, and I've had some discussions with people today, yes, that needs to go hand in hand with our focus on access, and of course we wouldn't be separating it from that. Where there are still a number of challenges in terms of how we talk about quality, we've got to keep on having this conversation. We're not doing something right if we're coming at this from very different perspectives still, in terms of how we're talking about a focus on learning and measuring learning outcomes. So I think that's a challenge for DFID and for all of us really to keep that going, and to tackle it in a more constructive way through our ongoing dialogue. A lot of points with me in the sessions today, in the political economy sessions, have been around how we're programming conflict areas. Alan spoke a lot about this earlier. I don't want to repeat points. But in terms of the conflict at an intrastate level, that really rings true in terms of some of the conversations we're trying to have within DFID. We're trying to get better at how we are engaging as education advisors with conflict advisors in country to try and understand, as a first step towards beginning to unpack some of the challenges we've got of operating where schools are being actively targeted in conflict areas. There's been some interesting thinking coming from my colleagues in Syria around this, particularly, as well as in some of our other contexts. And I think there's a lot of questions. How do we program in those contexts? Do we need to be thinking about this in a very different way in terms of what we are supporting, where we may be putting children at risk? And I think that needs much more of a conversation. The Safe Schools Declaration was brought up earlier. It was great, I think, that the UK and others have got behind this earlier this year. Yes, we need to think now about what that means in terms of where we are on it. We're doing some early thinking and coordination across government departments. We also need to be looking at what does this mean in particular countries where we're working, and Nigeria is one of the areas where we're beginning to have some of the conversations around what does our, as UK government supporting of this, what does that actually mean in practice? And finally, I know we're going to have a quick word about the research later on. One thing is, yes, DFID, we are trying to do more and more in terms of different types of research that we support, including research over a longer period of time. I think all of us need to also make sure that we are capturing those lessons on a more ongoing basis from the programs that we're supporting and the different ways in which we operate. It's something that we're pushing the multilaterals that we work with to do more of, something we're trying to do more internally. Earlier this year, we published with Cambridge the Education Emergencies Guidance Note as a kind of early step really within DFID to look at a literature review as far as we could, but also try to capture experience from our education advisors working in country, who are some of our most experienced in these kind of crisis contexts, and use some of those experiences to try and just sit alongside the literature that we do have and begin to get us thinking where we've got some of the gaps. I'll stop there, sorry, much longer than I intended, Ruth.
Hi everyone. So here is the kind of NGO rep, but conscious there are lots of other very knowledgeable NGO colleagues in the room, so please do jump in the comments and questions. And thanks to Benoit for raising all of the outcomes from the UN General Assembly. So I won't talk to that point, but I have left several of the Save the Children reports around that very issue of kind of turning these global commitments into reality on the ground. So please do feel free to grab them. But instead, I've been asked to reflect more on sort of the operational challenges around aid. And so three key points from me. We have seen some really exciting steps forward, I think, and it's important to recognise those. So kind of increasing prioritisation of education in emergencies, increased investment in certain instances, the 10%, for example, and development of ECW and so on, focus on research. So some exciting step forwards. But I think the first point is to recognise that these are just step forwards and there is still a long way to go. So the first point is a very practical one around more and better funding. We still know that EIE is dramatically underfunded. Education and humanitarian response plans remains critically underfunded. And also the nature of that funding. So we still often see very short-term funding cycles and funding cycles that aren't aligned with the school year and the implications that has for the children and young people in those centres or schools if funding is stopping after 6 months or halfway through the school year. If those teachers aren't being paid, those children can't sit those exams and so on. So some really kind of practical realities on the ground to consider. Also, if there are funding restrictions around the type of programming, so if depending on donor priorities, so if ECD isn't prioritised or youth isn't prioritised or social emotional support, for example. So again, and also in terms of the children who are able to reach, if they're not kind of considered one of the priority groups. So some practical things, I think, that we need to still call for more and better funding, while also recognising the fantastic step forwards that have been made. The second point, it's great to hear others speak to coordination, and that for us, Save the Children, is a real priority, really linking these issues around aid to the issue of coordination and a better planning, particularly if we're, as others have mentioned, protracted crisis. And so, how are we linking up across from these education emergencies, humanitarian response plans, and the education sector response plans, and everything that happens in between? And how can we all be working towards a set of linked, well-costed plans that help us bridge that divide and take a more approach that's more systems-focused? And I know we often call to donors for more aligned funding, but we as well have a real responsibility to not be doing kind of these piecemeal approaches, but all working towards kind of one bigger picture that we are all supporting. And the processes around that would become much more efficient and much more effective in terms of a longer term planning. And again, some positive steps in the move to more multi-year planning, but still a long way to go. So that would be the second priority area, I think. And then the third one, and this really speaks to this issue of quality, is around teachers and how we're supporting teachers. And again, this morning, it was really great to hear that that is increasingly being recognised as a priority. But we know that while it is we need to support teachers, there continues to be a critical issue around payment of teachers, and Ruth flagged this in her research. And what we're able to do for quality is going to be forever impeded unless we adequately support teachers financially, but also in terms of their well-being. So that would be the third point again. So quite operational in those three reflections, but hopefully a different perspective.
So thank you to all of our panelists. Some really good points there, and I'd like, while I've had a little bit more time to think through, perhaps there are other questions they'd like to phrase. This issue of alignment and dismal donor relationship. At the same time, that's what we're seeing in Juba, but we're seeing these great moves in great moves forward from where we were 10 years ago in New York. So how do you get that level of coordination that's beginning to happen in New York to happen in Juba? I guess that's my question. But perhaps there are other questions that you have that you'd like to put to other members of the panel.
Thank you. Well, I have a question for Joe. No, I'm a bit familiar with the work in South Sudan and with the work that you guys are doing there. Just interested in hearing a little bit your views on how in a country like South Sudan, there's quite a bit of money being channeled through the likes of MOT and other organizations. When it comes to, I mean, it's a difficult question, right? But just some reflection when it comes to sustainability and system strengthening with the South Sudanese education authorities. I know there's a lot of good work being done there. Maybe to share some of your views on the challenges there and the limitations, but also the potential on having huge operations on the ground should not be instead of what the government should be doing in terms of education. And I know it's necessary because otherwise there's at some points not a lot there. Maybe some thinking around that and how Jess relates to that and what we also do with you Impact. Yeah.
Okay. I made a point that around cash works, capitation grants that are going into schools, and the fact that the government in a situation where there was bankruptcy in terms of the budget, remember education officials and teachers have not been paid for nearly a year. That isn't to say that there's no money available, and the fact of the matter is that the South Sudanese government is not, Kir and Machar. I mean, there are people in the South Sudanese government, where it has been possible to exercise purchase, and this is a fact that 3 times more money has been committed to capitation grants going into schools by the South Sudanese government than the DFID contribution. In addition to that, there has been a lobby over the last 18 months, now that the oil appears, to be starting to flow again. There has been a lobby from many different quarters, including from development partners, to see an increased allocation to education in the budget, and you now have 10 times the amount, that has been committed in the budget for 2018 to 19 to enable some of these initiatives that have been started by Jess, but that also have been started on the humanitarian stage, being paid for, by the local by the South Sudanese government. And I'm not denying the fact, that there are huge amounts of money that are disappearing into the defence budget. But the fact of the matter is that as a result of good advocacy at particular levels, informed by political economy, that progress has really been made, and that there is a commitment on the part of the South Sudanese government through the Ministry of Finance to ensure that this initiative in relation to capitation grants, for example, is sustained. The same is also true in relation to cash transfers, and there is a discussion going on literally right now around the utilisation of the budget in terms of providing additional cash transfers to those that are being supplied by DFID. And the European Union, for everybody else's knowledge, is also stepped into the frame and actually is currently providing incentives to all teachers in primary schools. No, sorry, that's an exaggeration. There are 42,000 registered teachers in South Sudan at the moment. 30,000 of those are receiving an incentive that is actually 10 times their salary. A teacher's salary in South Sudan is $4 a month, and they are currently receiving considerable cash incentives, to bring them into school. It's working. But of course, the issue around sustainability is there. And I think that, again, there is a very, very informed, developing debate going on around the budget and around the way in which these things are actually going to be sustained. But a lot of it also comes down to ensuring that there is an informed dialogue taking place with advocacy, from key partners, which includes all development partners, but also includes the civil society organisations that are operating as a network inside the country.
Any other members of the panel? I've got a question.
Ruth, just very quickly to your point about the coordination, I think one thing I didn't mention is recognising that there are mechanisms in place that we should be drawing on and leveraging that kind of local knowledge and expertise, whether it's the cluster or the local education group or the other mechanisms, and using that as a way of bringing people together, but then considering that given how full on that is, the capacity there to do that in terms of the planning and coordination. But just really recognising there's already a lot of that happening, and it's just how we pull all that together, I think, and build capacity around it.
Thanks. Yep.
Okay. Okay, I've known Benoit a good while, so he's a good friend, so I can ask him a question, which, but I am asking this genuinely out of my own ignorance. I'm not trying to be clever or anything like that, but I mean, I was struck today how the UNHCR strategy is so much about integration into national systems, and I recognise academics were also involved in helping, develop that strategy or whatever. I'm just wondering to what extent. Well, I'm trying to put myself in the place of someone who's been displaced. I mean, there was a conflict in my own country, and there was displacement to a certain extent in people. I've been to Cyprus, and I have encountered people in different parts of the island who are still generations later saying, "We still have a house there. We still have land. I still want to go back." I'm just wondering to what extent the displaced people themselves have accepted the integration, because it has implications for the language of instruction. It has implications for the curriculum. It has implications where you're going to live and work the rest of your life. And, I'm just checking that this isn't some sort of high-level decision that's been taken about all refugees and displaced people, that you're going to be integrated into national systems of wherever you end up, despite what you may think about what your future could be if the conflict ends or circumstances change, or maybe you just want to go to some other country, maybe you want to come to Europe. Sorry, I'm being...
Can I answer right away? Okay, I think basically it's a debate, huh? It's a long debate. But you can have education for repatriation, okay? So you plan that your population, your refugee population will return. But is repatriation happening anywhere in the world at the moment? Very little. People are not returning home. So in the meantime, what we've seen with parallel systems is that the quality of education provided was just not there. Not to mention the issue of certification. I've tried to organize the certification for Burundian refugees in Tanzania on a number of occasions. I can tell you how difficult it is to involve the Ministry of Education in Burundi and bring representatives from the Ministry of Education from Burundi into camps in Tanzania, which has a number of protection issues. And it's basically the only way if you want to certify what students have learned in the camps, if you're using their home curriculum. So the reason we are advocating for the integration into national education systems is basically, one, quality, and two, certification. And working, regionally with our UNESCO colleagues who've done this kind of work in many parts of the world to try to reach harmonization and recognition of certificates regionally, so that when children ultimately return back home, they can be reintegrated at the right level within their own education system. But honestly, these days, despite our hope, where is repatriation taking place?
Yeah. No, I understand the rationale and the sort of and maybe the realities of it. I'm just wondering how it impacts on people in terms of, you know, it sounds like there's a lot being done to people in order to. I'm sorry, this is coming out the wrong way, but you know, and again, trying to put myself in those persons' shoes, I would feel. So you're telling me that, you know, the reality is you're not going home. You'll have to learn a new language. We'll support you to do that.
It's
Or,
certainly
I mean,
not.
what's the dynamics in the field of these kind of processes?
It's going to become a dialogue. Huh? Perhaps Ruth will not agree with this idea, but let's just say that it's not UNHCR that is saying you cannot go back home. It's the reality on the ground that is showing that people cannot return.
Yeah.
Thanks. I want to open
But
it.
are there other options to move somewhere?
Just conscious we need to open it up to the floor. And I know I've primed a few people, but I'll just open it up to the floor in general. I can see, can we take the first three I've seen? So Anne and this lady and the gentleman behind. Yep. Sorry, I don't know your names.
Easy one.
Thanks. Aisha, I just wanted to follow on from what you were saying as you were talking. I mean, it's something I've been thinking about a lot. Is it not... Aisha, I've got another question, Ruth. Is that all right if I just add to that conversation? But is it not... Would one not say, and of course we're not in that position, you're quite right, I'm not displaced, you're not displaced, you know, nobody on the panel, I think, is IP. So would it not be a matter of pragmatically, I need to get my certificate, I need to get, you know, I'm here. But in my heart... my heart is still in Palestine or whatever, and there's that duality. Possibly, I don't know. I'm not in that position, but it may be you have a duality that I really belong to Palestine, Syria, whatever. Pragmatically, yeah, I'm going to get through the education system and get a degree or whatever because I have to. So, as I say, I just think of it as a sort of coming to terms with what you need to do, but your heart or your emotions are somewhere else, something like that. I've got another. I don't know if you want to. I've had a question.
I'll take them all. I'll take all the questions and then give a quick.
So my question was around assessing the long-term impact of what we're doing. I think somebody mentioned it somewhere at one point, but it hasn't come out a lot in the discussions. I've done a little bit of research around this area, and that there has been very little. And please, I stand corrected if I'm wrong. But the data I was looking at, very little at looking at the long term. I'm talking about 3, 4, 5, 10 years later. The long-term impact of work that we're doing. I'm looking at education projects particularly. So first of all, correct me if I'm wrong, if there is a lot of work, then that's really interesting. But secondly, I don't think there is. So what, from anybody of the panel, how do they see, and I know there are financial reasons for that not happening. It's often not budgeted in for a number of reasons. But what is the thinking from anybody on the panel on how that might happen? Because we talk about sustainability, but we actually never assess if, 10 years down the line, it has been sustainable.
Thanks. Thanks. I'm Naomi from Charlie Goldsmith Associates. And I'm just, so again, leading on from the question about the UN and this this aspect of integration in education, I'm just wondering about the do no harm principle and specifically looking at conflict settings, whether there's a risk that, earlier we were talking about security and national interests and the implications for where we're putting aid, for example. Is there any discussion about the potential that kind of a policy could actually later on cause conflict within, within host communities or, I feel like I'm sure you'll be able to answer that and And the other thing that I was just going to quickly say was about what you have been saying earlier. It's just really a comment rather than a question about how sad it is that and how unfortunate it is that so many humanitarian programs don't recognize education as key and as a priority, especially since schools are uniquely positioned within communities to access such huge numbers of people through families, etc., and extended families. And what a shame it is that we haven't been able to have more coordination in terms of, health through schools and food through schools, etc. So, yeah.
And the gentleman behind? Sorry, can you keep them short?
First, I would like to thank John and congratulate him on the GEST project. My name is David Shahatan from St. Mark's Coptic School in Juba. Myself and Sherry Neal, we knocked doors in Juba over 1 year ago, and the only organization that really opened the door was GEST. We were not looking for money, we're looking just to understand the environment, understand what the right things to do. So congratulations on that. I think they had the culture there is an outward open culture rather than inward. We knocked other doors. I would like not to mention names. So this is what I would like to say. The second thing is, I don't agree with John about that British interests shouldn't be considered, because what I would like the kids that I teach at the school is to have eventually vocational training and get a job, not end up like some kids in Uganda with no job at the end. And that's how I see things maybe in 15 years. Thank you.
We're short of time, so I'm going to go for two more voices from the floor. So the lady with the red and Chancellor Downer to speak as well.
Two really quick points. One, my question about the idea of trying to use the national curriculum, the country's curriculum, and what happens in situations like in Bangladesh right now, where they have to develop their own curriculum because, in terms of what's your position then on if there's a political drive to not do that, and where do you stand on that, basically? And then the other question was more a general comment on the GEST program and any other program that's similar. Those large, huge programs like that. What are you doing in terms of ensuring inclusion of vulnerable groups such as children with disabilities? Is that included in the programme, and where are they in that? Because there's not been any mention of that in this afternoon's discussion at all.
Very quickly, in response to the question about sustainability, I do want to point out that we are studying sustainability of community-based education in Afghanistan, and we're also looking at how those programs integrate with government. We do have a lot of data on this, and we're producing our baseline report, which will be available to the public soon on our website, and please look for it. We'd love to share that information with all of you.
Right. I'm going to go back through the panel, and I'm rather than adding this as an extra question at the end, I'm going to throw in a question now, chair prerogative. So INEE are currently developing a strategic research agenda. And by the way, INEE is definitely not an American-only organization. It's open and free to join, and everyone can join. If you can respond to the questions, but also, what would you say is a priority for donors of research or conductors of research? What needs to be researched or what needs to be done about research in this field? So, sorry, a load of questions and something on research.
Okay, try and be quick. In terms of a little piece of work I did with the EC around refugees and talking to EU missions, the priorities that seem to be coming from people in the field in relation to refugees were the kind of cross-border issues I think that you were mentioning about, who are the educators, how do you get recognition for them, certification across borders, and so there seems to be a particular challenge around, who's the catalyst for that? Given that there's not great donor coordination, who's the catalyst to engage the relevant authorities on across borders in these situations to resolve those very practical issues? That's one. However, you would not be surprised to learn that there is also a political economy around research. So if I were advising INE about a research agenda, what I would do is refer back to the 4 Rs that Mario mentioned this morning, of which we had vested interest in developing. And I would say the research agenda needs not just to address pressing priorities in terms of humanitarian need, but to look at the extent to which research is able to contribute to informing systemic transformation. To what extent are education systems, in whatever situation they're operating in, contributing to systemic transformation? And that means looking at a number of fronts. It would fall under the 4 Rs. Redistribution, to what extent is education part of the problem or part of the solution? Is it maintaining inequalities? Is it reproducing inequalities? Or is it contributing to redistribution of opportunity, of resources, etc.? To what extent is education responding to representation within systems, about governance issues, about accountability within systems? To what extent is that happening or taking place? Third are recognition issues, which is all about the inclusion agenda, I think, and marginalised and vulnerable populations, and to what extent is the education system actually addressing the needs of those people? And the fourth R in ours, which was about reconciliation, but I think it's as much about the legacies of these crises that inevitably, you know, there's not suddenly legacies, but they build up and they become intergenerational. To what extent is education contributing to addressing some of these? I'm thinking, for example, in places like Colombia, where, you know, we've had a whole generation or more of children educated within the system in areas that were controlled by FARC and had teachers and who were working there. What's the legacies of that for a country like Colombia? What values do these children have? What do they think? How do they think about their role in the future of Colombia? The same with Iraq. We heard Kelsey talking in one of the workshops about how teachers operated during the ISIS occupation in Mosul. But now that ISIS are no longer in control of the situation there, teachers are suddenly coming under scrutiny from the authorities as to whether they're trustworthy or, you know, why were they able to still teach in this situation whenever ISIS was in control? There's a legacy to be left there. Will there be purging now of teachers in that situation or whatever? So I would use the 4 Rs. I'm bluntly saying that, you know, this is a framework that we help develop and subscribe to. But I think it's a good one if you're thinking about systemic change. And then my very last area is about why are we still not doing anything about strengthening research capacity in the countries where the research is actually taking place. Lip service is paid to this. It's paid to this in all the calls that I have experienced in terms of academic research. You know, you need to work with local partners. You need to whatever. Very rarely is it done in a truly sustainable capacity developing way. There's no investment in higher education, research skills and capacity or other agencies within it. And I think it's a hugely neglected area. So why would you expect there to be, you know, the kind of strength of research analysis coming out of these situations if you don't invest in them? Over and out.
Over and out. Thank you. We'll have to keep them very short, please. Just
yes,
final
very short.
comments
I'm not
and
going to
responses.
say anything about research. You've spoken a lot. Huh?
Yeah.
But quickly to respond to your point, in Dadaab refugee camp, how many Somalis ever lived in Somalia? One example, Doloado, again, how many Somalis were ever lived in their own country, you know? I think with 2/3 of refugees living in protracted situations, that's basically our rationale to go for integration. Then the point on do no harm, I think it's to the contrary. When you put refugee children side by side with children from the host communities, which is part of this integration, you're actually strengthening social cohesion. Thank you.
Okay, so I just want to say, go in reverse order in terms of the questions. I mean, on the research agenda, to add to what Alan had said, I think that there's a massive need for longitudinal studies that are looking post-programme. That also enables me to answer your question about sustainability. It's a great shame that Andy Brock is not in the room, because he has recently undertaken a really interesting visit to China to look at the impact of a program that was run in Gansu, made a wonderful film about it, looking at some of the girls and young women that had received stipends and looking at what had happened 10 years post-program. I think the need for kind of cohort studies like that, longitudinal studies like that, many of which could be done by local people, actually. That's one way that you can also really begin to build research capacity. We ran another program in Bangladesh for quite some time, English in Action, where we introduced a whole kind of modality of action research for teachers who were being embraced by the program. The program closed out about 6 months ago, and it was wonderful to go and listen to teachers who'd been involved in action research for over 3 years, actually, where they developed really strong research skills and were delivering very, very important pieces of, let's say, evidence that are there for an ongoing basis. The question that there was about the curriculum and Bangladesh is a really interesting one. I think that the thing that immediately springs to mind is there has to be an interface around that, but we have to wait until we're invited to the table. You know, we started a program in Bangladesh, and of course the textbooks were a mess. And we didn't go down the avenue that many people had gone down 10 years previously. Yeah, you need to rewrite all your textbooks and you insult the immediate academic community of the host country. Wait to be invited to the table. It took 5 years, but eventually we were invited to the table as a result of, in inverted commas, propaganda by deed. I mean, and I think that it's, you know, we have to be humble about the way in which we approach that, but there's obviously a really important need to interface around that. And on the issue to do with, there's one last thing about the humanitarian opportunity that there is in relation to education. I think this is a really incredibly pertinent point. And I want to give a little bit of the other side of the equation as well. There are many humanitarian initiatives that are taking place where they are actually working inside education. And I think the important thing is to also build on that. I mean, there are many UNICEF initiatives which I can be incredibly critical of, but I also take my hat off to several UNICEF initiatives that I know where they are really trying to work in a very, very constructive way inside some humanitarian initiatives.
Perhaps just one question, address one of those many questions.
Yeah, I mean, also the humanitarian issue is that I mean, what I want to say is that I mean we're moving into the right direction. So this means that a lot of stuff is happening on the ground, and humanitarian actors are being more and more open to education and emergencies. Having said that, the capacity building of the humanitarian sector to engage meaningfully with the wider education sector development, that's a challenge that needs to be addressed. I think the capacity of humanitarian aid workers on the ground really. The research question, I think one very important area which has not been mentioned is the innovative financing. I think if you engage like the EU at you know in these new initiatives, International Financing Facility for Education, you see a group of people, so 9 out of 10 are financing experts coming from the banking sector, etc., speaking about really complicated issues around innovative financing. One person is an education expert. So the education sector to be better equipped to all this upcoming bigger, new, innovative financing schedules, schemes, whatever you want to call them. I think some research on how to be prepared for that would be really interesting, actually.
So just a couple of quick points. On the point around do no harm, to link that sort of really to the work we're thinking about much more around the safeguarding issues. So we do have DFID's got the Safeguarding Summit coming up with multilateral organisations later on this month. Obviously, there was a lot more scrutiny at the moment around policies and implementation of policies, but also trying to do some work to look with the offices where we work in country to really try to get to grips with what those issues are within an education environment. So actually, what are those kind of issues in schools and the kinds of violence that are taking place in schools? So putting that much higher up on our priority list. The point on children with disabilities, I completely agree. We need to be doing far more. We've got some small instances in some of our programming, for example in Jordan and others, but it's very small scale. So both within our bilateral programs as well as opportunities that we have to influence globally, again, need to do far more on that. On the research side, again, agree on the point around longer term research. You know, the key example that DIF has been supporting, not in crisis context specifically by any means, but is the Young Lives work. That, you know, is the longitudinal study. Now, we're exploring now what our future education research in protracted crises and conflict areas might look like, and whether we have the scope to do things over a number of years. But within that, we're also trying to pull on a few thematic focuses, also aligned to the guidance we did earlier this year. And the kind of issues that are coming up on that are around accountability, around political settlements, cost-effective delivery, actually not something we've really touched upon today, quality and learning, and around data monitoring and evaluation. So I think a lot of those thematic areas pick up on some of the bits that we've been looking at today. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Hi, thanks, Ruth. I'll be quick. And maybe just the conversation around formal systems, integration and so on. And just again to flag the role of the teacher in making education relevant and meaningful to children, whatever system they're in. But to do that, if we could make it so that refugee teachers are allowed to teach and are paid to do so, that would make a big difference to that. Sorry to keep going on about that. And another good area of focus for research. Also, just to echo again the point about reaching the most marginalised, most vulnerable children. Again, we would really agree with that. And in terms of cross-sectoral work, just to flag that there's going to be an event in October that's a child protection and education in emergencies joint event around integrated programming, which I think is a really exciting step forward. Obviously, that's just two sectors coming together, but I think it's a great step forward. In terms of research, we're very excited about the I&E agenda, and Save the Children are also doing a big push around this. My colleague, Jess Oddy, Jess, can you wave for everybody, is leading some really exciting work, developing an agenda, very child-focused, looking at what works for children and why, and she's doing a lot of work at the moment to make that research agenda as effective as possible, to align with the sector. So not to defer the question, but just to encourage you all to grab Jess and ask about the exciting work she's doing around research.
Great. Well, I'd like you to join me in thanking our panel very much. Sorry for the lack of time, but thank you.
Just like to welcome you to a very short session where we're going to have two presentations to take up the theme of research. I think one of the things that's come out of today is the need for more research in various areas of education in emergencies. And I'd like to welcome back, first of all, Dana in her role as editor of the Journal of Education in Emergencies, and she's going to share with us a little bit about the journal and opportunities for publishing in there and for encouraging work with authors located in some of those contexts, which I think is something, again, that we've talked about today. Thanks.
Thank you. So it's been a really long day for all of you. Oops. And it's been a long day for me, too, because I'm on New York Times still, since I came in yesterday. So I'm going to try to be brief and pithy. So I will speak briefly about the journal, and then I'll also talk. I was also asked to sort of talk about key points that I heard today, so I'll make some final remarks. The Journal on Education Emergencies, I'm so thrilled to be here to talk to you about it today because, as you know, our upcoming next special issue is on refugee education, very relevant for the group here. Please do submit articles if you have them. We have let me first tell you how we were established. We were established not only to address gaps in research, but also to address gaps in voices. This is really important. The Journal on Education Emergencies is meant to and does also publish academics from the Global South, not just academics from the Global North. We also work to support and provide capacity to academics in the Global South. We were created as part of INEE. We're housed at New York University. I'm the editor-in-chief, which you heard. We also have a board member in the room, Ruth Naylor. Thank you so much, Ruth, did Ruth go away? Thank you, Ruth, also for helping organize today, because Ruth is part of the reason the journal is here on the panel. We were also established as the first academic journal in the field for education emergencies. We bring together academic publications along with field notes and podcasts, and because we are exclusively online, we can do very innovative things. I'll tell you a little bit about some of those innovative things. So this is a description of our publications. I want to point out that the academic articles are meant to be something you would see in a top-tier peer-reviewed journal, like in education we compare ourselves to the Journal on International Educational Development or Comparative Education Review. Those are the journals that we compare ourselves to. In political science, you might think of the journal called International Organization. It's a terrific journal. If you haven't had a chance to take a look at it, I do recommend it. Those are the academic articles, the research articles that we publish. We also publish field notes. Field notes are meant to provide description of a program, a process. They're meant to be written by anyone who has practitioner field-based experience, anyone who wants to write about something they see as really innovative, or perhaps a debate that they saw. One of our field notes pieces was written by a woman who was sent to evaluate education for Iraqi detainees in on a U.S. Army base in Iraq. Fascinating and very provocative. I recommend that you take a look at it when you get a chance. We also offer book reviews, and we try to review every book that comes out in the field. We're a little bit behind. We have a number, we have a stack, all of the recent books that have appeared. So please do go to the journal to check out the latest research of the field. We're trying to cover it, and you should find it there. If not in this issue, then in our following issues. We also have this special innovation that we've just started. We produce podcasts. You can hear some of the people in the room on our last podcast. I'm looking at Mario sitting over there. Alan also, I think, is featured on that podcast. Mike, Mario, and Alan wrote a piece together on their 4 Hours article and then produced a beautiful podcast, which is quite innovative. I'm not sure. We don't always have all of the authors on each podcast, but these podcasts, people tell me they listen to them on the subway. I'm sure they listen to them on, what do you call it here? The Underground, thank you. I forgot for a second. I'm sure that happens here too. So please do go and listen to our podcast. It's a way to spread the information. Another big topic today has been about information dissemination. We find our podcasts can get evidence out there to audiences in a way that's different from downloading an academic article or downloading a field note. So they actually get to hear the authors describe behind the scenes, how did it work, what are the key takeaways from these articles that they've written. As I mentioned, all articles, both research articles and field notes, they go through double-blind peer review. I'm not sure if I mentioned, it's an open access journal. That means we have no source of revenue. We work through volunteer time from the board, from our reviewers. A number of reviewers are also in the room. Volunteer space from NYU. NYU devotes a little bit of space, not a separate space. It's actually my office, to be frank. But NYU provides support for the journal institutionally in that way, and also has recently provided the online library database for the journal, which has been terrific. We also provide to authors access to all of INE's network. INE's network is vast now. It's about 14,000 people around the world. Everyone who subscribes to INE gets the journal in their inboxes, one click away. So, final thoughts and takeaways. I'd love to talk more about the journal, but I was also asked to speak just a little bit about a few final thoughts from the day, and I also made some scribbles during the last panel, which I really enjoyed. So systems research, critical area for additional research to understand process and outcomes. I did mention, I couldn't resist when our colleague here asked about sustainability. I did want to mention that we are doing this work in Afghanistan. We will have excellent data. It's only a start, right? There are many questions related to system change, many of which Alan highlighted just now. I think looking at the 4 Rs, which you can find in the journal on Education and Emergencies, looking at the 4 Rs framework is critically important when thinking about power dynamics and thinking about the hidden questions and agreements that go on in making in bargaining to get education emergencies programs supported by governments that are funding them. I did leave a link to our website here, and I will send that to everyone. Will have access to this PowerPoint. That's my understanding. I want to mention something that came up in my workshop on gender earlier today. I think it's so critical. I wanted to make sure that everybody who stuck it out the whole day actually got to hear this point as well. One of the aspects of gender inclusion and disability inclusion and minority inclusion and diversity in the traditional way that we talk about diversity in the United States, in other words, diversity, having people in this room who don't actually look like us, who might have a skin color that's a little bit different than ours, that is something we need to work on in our field. And we need to work on not only including voices from the Global South, but including voices right here in the room from others who might look a little bit different from us. In terms of representation, in terms of gender, we need to have, and all of these aspects of diversity, inclusion, representation, we need to have representation from the top to the bottom of all of our organizations, all of the organizations that we work for. Not just teachers in remote rural schools, not just on panels, not just a token woman on a panel, but representation that's thorough and acknowledged at the tops of our organizations and embodied by the tops of our organizations. I understood, Sharon and I had a brief conversation about this in the hallway. I understand that right here, the organization we're in has policies to look inside at its gender dynamics. This is, as you know, a big issue in the United States right now with the Me Too movement. I think it's critical. I think it's critical that we talk about it in our own organizations, in our own conversations in this workshop today. Finally, the last point I want to comment on, actually 2 last points, if you'll humor me. How am I doing on time? Good. Oh, good. Okay. But I'm mindful that we've all been here. It's been a long day, and I don't want to keep you any longer than we need to be kept. There's wine waiting for us, I understand. I want to talk about a couple of sticking points in research and implementation in places where we work, in hard-to-access places and hard-to-work places. It's turnover among staff at all kinds of organizations, turnover among staff at NGOs, turnover among staff at ministries of education, and turnover among staffs at donor organizations. What that does is it prevents institutional memory. It hobbles institutional memory. So it's difficult to have continuity in any kind of project, whether it's a program implementation, program that's being implemented or a program that's being studied in either research or implementation. It's important to consider how to combat that effect of staff turnover. The humanitarian development continuum, I feel like we've dispensed with this issue a long time ago. It's pernicious. It keeps coming back. I'm not sure why. I think we should all acknowledge that there is really no such thing as an emergency in some ways. I'm saying something a little bit heretical. Or let me put it in a different way. There's no such thing as emergency in which aid can operate. You can drop aid from the sky when there's the type of emergency that's such a crisis in which you can't implement education. If you can't implement education programs, you can't implement any aid program. It's just not, it doesn't, the people who would do that work shouldn't be asked to go and aren't willing to go. So I think understanding what we mean by it, it's a term of art, emergency. And we use it as a term of art, and we should continue to use it as a term of art because it motivates people. People understand education cannot wait. There's a reason for the name of the new organization at the UN, and an important reason. People need an urgent response to their education priorities and their education gaps. Displaced populations need education provided, support provided to them quickly. So we should not lose that, but it can't hobble our approach. It can't cloud our vision, our understanding of whether or not education can be provided. The last point is about our strategic research agenda. We had this meeting in New York last week. It was kind of a wrap-up of the UNGA. It was meant to launch the first in a series of conversations about the Education Emergencies Research Agenda. INE kicked it off. I think there will be some additional organizations that will be involved, including Dubai Cares, which has been very committed to funding education emergencies research. So please do watch your INE membership announcements for additional information. There will be additional information forthcoming about that. All of you in the room will be also called upon to participate in that process in some way or another. What came out of the meeting last week was simply one point that was very important, is that it's very difficult to prioritize, to actually create a priority within the strategic agenda, because every organization has its own priorities. So it may not be something that will prioritize organizational interests. It won't be that. But it will certainly try to bring the voices from people who need the research to the attention of those who want to fund and do the research. I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to be here today. I really appreciate your attention.
Thank you very much, Lena, and thank you very much to the Journal for supporting this event. So we move now to our final speaker for the day, Kelsey Shanks, who's from the University of Ulster, but is here in her role as the education lead for the GCRF. And those of you who don't live in the land of research funding, that's the Global Challenges Research Fund, which I'm going to actually hand over to Kelsey to explain what it is and what exciting opportunities we hope coming up.
Thank you. Yeah, so as explained, my name's Kelsey. I have two hats. I've been here engaging today in the workshops because my academic interests look at education and conflict, primarily in the Middle East. But I've also just been appointed as the GCRF Challenge Leader for Education, which is 50% of my time. And it's been engaging in their kind of strategic priorities and how they look at their portfolio funding. So I was going to take you a little bit through GCRF and who they are and where they've come from, but I think you might all fall asleep. So I'll do that very, very quickly. Just in terms of the funding landscape for the UK, there are lots of, obviously, traditional pots of money for academic funding that fund lots of ODA country research, but there are also specific areas of funding that we can access in terms of these kind of different programming. So we've talked today about DFID's research agenda. There's the Newton Fund, Global Challenges Research Fund, the Ross Fund and Fleming. They're more health-focused funds that are specifically looking at global challenges. So I'm a little bit scared to bring this up, actually, after all the discussions we've had today, but I thought in the issues, sort of in the interest of transparency, I should probably say where the money comes from. So we are funded through BEIS, which is the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And we administer our funds through the traditional academic research councils and academies. We obviously have a tied-in agenda with the UK aid objectives, and we've tried to fit in with DFID's objectives and fund research that will be beneficial to them also. But where we differ from that slightly is we have ring-fenced the money so there is academic freedom, so we're not constrained by countries of interest or themes. Our research agendas are hopefully, and what we're trying to encourage, is generated from the bottom up, from partnerships in countries that are being targeted for research by the academic community and NGOs in the countries of the actual research is taking place. So our main objectives, as you can see, our key aims are for cutting-edge research and innovation that addresses problems faced by developing countries. So all our research has to be in ODA DAC-listed countries. It seeks to promote interdisciplinary research that strengthens local capacity. So as Alan was saying, one of the things we don't know if we're getting it completely right, but we are trying and we're very mindful, is to use the money to develop in-country research capacity. So 50% of our spend has to be done in partnership with actors on the ground, whether that be a university or an NGO with research capacity in terms of a partnership rather than a research co-I. If you're an academic in the UK, you will obviously be familiar with the delivery partners, probably more so with ESRC, AHRC, and the British Academy in terms of education research. But we do obviously administer funds through lots of others. And actually in the portfolio at the moment, we have more education research funded by MRC, the Medical Research Council, which is really interesting to me in terms of access and that sort of cross-sectorial focus that everyone was focusing on today and emphasising today. So there are two key things that help frame the GCRF pot of money. The strategy for GCRF is developed to informed by the Sustainable Development Goals, and also in terms of the UK aid strategy, as I mentioned before. So within that strategy, there are 6 challenge areas that we've identified that fall within these 3 different areas: equitable access to sustainable development, sustainable economies and societies, and human rights and good governance and social justice. Those themes are global health, food systems, conflict, resilience, education, and sustainable cities. So obviously I'm leading on the education portfolio. It's the smallest so far out of all the different portfolios, if I just skip ahead a little bit. We have funded, I think, 37 projects, and in comparison to health and the other sectors, that's very small. And they aren't all led by educationalists either. They are sections within other disciplines. So a lot of our research it's meant to be interdisciplinary, but there is very few of those projects in those countries that are led by educationalists. And that's something we want to improve. We want to sort of amplify the education voice within the fund and encourage more applications. So I would like to be able to say, we are going to fund, and then give you a big list of things that we're interested in. And that's not quite possible, unfortunately. We do have areas of interest that I can say are, we are exploring and we're waiting for final confirmation, but education in conflict and crisis is a huge area that we're looking at and a huge area that we would like to be involved in. So much so that we've committed to the INE research agenda to hold some more, as we were just talking about, the local level consultations. GCRF are hoping to have local level regional consultations to identify more local driven research questions and also identify opportunities for those sort of on the ground researchers to connect with our UK academic researchers for future applications. So some of the areas that we would like to look at and we are trying to push forward are education and conflict. Within that, education's role in pushing forward development of the other areas of sustainable development, looking at the cross-portfolio kind of mix, so health, urbanisation, cities, food and nutrition, and obviously conflict. We're also very interested in early childhood development education and the role of that also in conflict and emergency situations. But one thing I would say, just to highlight, although I can't guarantee there will be a pot of money, we are very interested in that, all of the different challenge areas, we've tried to embed an education focus in. So there is a pot of money, obviously, for conflict and protracted crisis. And I would really recommend to all researchers that you look at those calls as well as the education calls. Health also. We're looking for interdisciplinary partnerships on our research agenda. So it would be really nice to see the calls that are being put out through the other challenge areas accessed by education academics or NGOs or people on the ground to further that kind of agenda and that mix of voices. So you can access all of our information on our website, but we'll also be tweeting as challenge leaders across the different portfolios. My email is there, and I think it's probably better if I take questions if you have any questions, either afterwards with drinks or now. Okay?
Thank you very much. Thanks. Really informative. Thank you. So, as Kelsey said, in the interest of time, as we're very near to the scheduled end of the day, I don't want to keep you by having any more questions. So, as the chair of the UKFIET executive, I just wanted to finish by saying 3 things. First of all, I wanted to thank everybody here who's come for the day. I'm a great believer that events are created by the people who participate in them. They're not shows that we put on. They're actually something that emerges from the dialogue and the discussions that happen on the day. And the impression I've had today is that it's been highly interactive. So thank you very much for everybody who's contributed. This has been kind of innovation for us. As Sharon said at the beginning, we have our biannual conference, which will be next September, and we wanted to do something in the other year. So this is the first time we've had such a large whole-day event. So we're very interested to get feedback. So do grab anybody who's from UKFIET, give us some feedback, and we will be sending you a little questionnaire to get a few comments on the day. It would be great if you could send those back, because that will help inform us when we're thinking about our programme over the next year or two, and whether we repeat this kind of event, how we might change it. And the second thing I wanted to say was to advertise, really promote a couple of events that we're having over the next few weeks. So next week, on the 11th of October, we're working with the Global Education Monitoring Report team to run a consultation on the 2020 report, which is on inclusion. So this is quite a small event. It's a workshop type event. So we have invited some key researchers and practitioners in the area, but I'm very happy to send invite to anybody else who says they're interested and who we might inadvertently have missed off the list. So if you think you would be interested in coming to join us at that event next week, it's Thursday afternoon in London, just let me know. I think my email somewhere, or Sarah Jeffrey email through the website. And then we have a much, much bigger event in November. Again, we're working with the Global Education Monitoring Report team to launch the 2019 report, which is on migration and displacement. So that will be a large afternoon event held at the Wellcome Collection on the Euston Road in London from about 2 o'clock. We'll be sending out the details of that in the next few days. So I do encourage you to sign up, and that's a very, very inclusive event. We welcome students, postgraduate students, or even undergraduate students, practitioners, researchers, and so on, to come to that event and hear about what's in this year's report. 20th of November is the day it gets released. There are, I think, 3 other kind of global launches. The main launch is in Berlin, which I'm sure you can understand why that's been chosen. But we are having our own launch in London at the same time. And finally, just some really big thanks. Thank you very much to my colleagues on the UKFIET executive who led the organisation and planning of this. Sharon, Mario and Ruth, thank you very much indeed. It's been brilliant. Thanks to Sarah Jeffrey, who's unfortunately not been with us today, but played a big role in doing all the organisation. To Sandra, our engagement fellow, who's been tweeting and so on and interviewing some of you. And then lastly, to all the staff at Cambridge Education, to Grace, I'm going to miss someone out, Elisabetta, and Tom, who've done an excellent job in making sure that we were all choreographed in the right place at the right time with the correct information. So thank you very much indeed, and thank you to Andy Brock and other colleagues at Cambridge Education for hosting this today and supporting it with us. So please now. Thank you.
Thanks to you as well. Yes. For all your work.
Thanks, Mario. So now please join us for a glass of wine, actually, if you have time before you catch your train. So, enjoy.